I've got a fever. A Resident Evil fever. Welcome to Resimania, a series about my latest obsession, Resident Evil. Today we're going to understand Resident Evil on a really basic level, the way you need to know the difference between a fridge and an oven before you can cook a 4-course meal, but there will be 2 more videos in this series. One about the game design of the franchise, and the other about the ideology and politics of the games. The Resident Evil fandom is enormous, intense, and all-consuming. There are stories upon stories that have no right to be considered connected, and yet somehow supposedly take place in the same universe. There are knife-only speedruns for every single game where people simply reject the decadent modern technology of, gun and battle their way through the whole thing with just a combat knife. There are whole entire streamers and YouTubers and game critics who are so into Resident Evil that it goes into their bios and introductions and even usernames like an official credential. After this series, I fully expect to be one of those critics who puts Resident Evil Girl or Leon Kennedy Stan or developer of the official Big Butts and Barefoot mod for Resident Evil 6 in my bio, because although I'm making these videos to get through my Resident Evil fever, I don't expect I'm going to be able to get all of it. And here's the thing about a virus. If you don't get it all, it can mutate and come back stronger. That said, I'm not that experienced in the fandom right now. Cards on the table, I started playing Resident Evil last year, and I've fallen in deep, but I haven't been a fan for nearly as long as anybody else. I hope that's my niche here. I'm not a professor of Resiology, but I can help you get into a franchise I've absolutely fallen in love with, just like I did with The Witcher last year. Throughout the series, I'm going to keep coming back to shout out different folks I think talk intelligently about the franchise, and if I want to pretend that isn't just imposter syndrome, I'll say it's because the whole world of Resi is so dang large that there's always more to talk about and consider. Okay, let's start understanding Resident Evil for people who've been truly living under a rock. Resident Evil is a Japanese video game franchise with over 24 total games, and video games, of course, are for boys, and this channel is not for boys. That said, I heard from male friends who say things like, "I'm brewing my own IPA," and "Deus Ex is really good, you should try it," and "Hey, have you ever considered selling feet pics?" That there's plenty for someone like me in Resident Evil as well. There are absurd outfits and cheesy one-liners.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
Ridiculous characters and anime boyfriends like Leon Kennedy with soft floppy hair and kind eyes. And of course, at the end of every game, you get to pull out a big gun and walk right up to the bad guy and ram it down his throat and blow his fucking brains out. And if that isn't game design for women, I don't know what is. Resident Evil has been around now for over 25 years, and in that time, it's been a lot of different things. But now there's a great reason for the queers to get into the franchise, thanks to Resident Evil Village and Lady Mommy the tall vampire lady from Resident Evil Village. I actually first got into the franchise through Resident Evil 2 Remake, which is, we'll return to this point, a fucking masterpiece. Just incredible. Around about the time I played that and loved it, people started getting extremely horny online for this tall vampire woman, and I decided to get Resident Evil Village, also known as Resident Evil 8, in a Steam bundle with the previous game, Resident Evil 7. If you don't know, 7 and 8 focus on the story of the same protagonist, Ethan Winters, who wasn't in the series before, so jumping in at 7 is a great way to try the franchise. Then, by the time I'd played 2 and 3 Remake and 7 and 8, and absolutely loved every second of them, I knew I was going to make Resimania. I was contracting a Resident Evil fever, a T-virus, if you will, and the only cure is lots of long video essays about Resident Evil. Even if the rest of the franchise had turned out to be hot, steaming, raw dog shit, that would have been interesting in its own right because of the enormous range of quality between different games. And let me tell you, some of the rest of the franchise is really good. What is fear? This is a question people who tell scary stories have had to grapple with for hundreds and thousands of years. What do people fear? Why do people fear? Why do people like telling stories that make other people afraid? And much more strangely, why do people enjoy stories that frighten them so much? What are the different ways that people can be afraid, and how different are they really? Is there some kind of core fear, the thing itself, or is fear a convergent reaction stemming from infinitesimal factors? Resident Evil's approach to horror is, at first glance, kind of cheap. I don't mean financially when I say that. The franchise has never shied away from spectacle or impressive graphics. In fact, its visual achievements are some of the things that set the series apart right from the beginning. When I say that it's cheap, I'm talking about how people tend to perceive horror. The thing people hate the most, or perhaps the thing most people hate in modern horror, is the jump scare. And they hate it because it feels like it was easy, unearned, cheap in terms of frightening you. If I told you that in the next minute of this video, I'm going to do a jump scare, but I won't tell you when, then you're already tensing up, waiting for the sudden fright to come, bracing your body against the inevitable shock of whatever I'm going to do. You're doing all the work of frightening yourself for me, and you know it, and I know it, and the modern horror movie filmmakers know it too, which is why they constantly fill spooky scenes with loads of places where a potential ghoul or goblin or serial killer or transsexual with a knife could be hiding. You can't help but try to figure out what's gonna happen, and that makes you afraid. Resident Evil takes a similar approach. Its scares come not from a pervasive sense of your cosmic insignificance or a social reality that pits you against the people around you or some kind of creepy demon that's an allegory for the welfare system, but instead from stuff you find scary being on the screen in front of your eyes. Zombies and snakes and giant spiders and melting hillbilly mold men and exploding John Carpenter-esque mutant people, and all of them are chasing you, and all of them want to kill you all the time. And hey, on top of that, since we've taken a moment to comment on the cinematography of jump scares, what about the cinematography of the franchise itself? The first 5 entries in the series, Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, 0, and Code Veronica, all used fixed camera angles. Fixed camera angles can create a jarring sense for the player that they aren't in control of their environment, that the world refuses to bend to their will, but they can also be used to tell a horror story and ramp up the tension themselves. Now, in the first game, I think the developers were largely trying to find the best way to communicate just visually using these angles, but from the second game on, they've really hit their stride. Take, for example, these 4 shots from Resident Evil 2. In the first, as you approach the window, a licker, a new kind of monster you haven't met yet that crawls on walls and ceilings and responds to sound, scurries across the window. The genius decision here is to make the next shot, when you walk through the door and into the corridor, a shot looking into the building from outside, from up and slightly to the side, the exact angle the licker would be watching you from if we could see from its eyes. In the third shot, as we round the corner, there's a body on the floor, and by now in the game, we're used to bodies coming to life and attacking us, so the eye immediately jumps to it, and to the fact that it isn't coming to life, because something ripped its head off. Everything is telling you not to go down this hallway, but you know you have to in order to progress, and once you do, the licker will finally be revealed after all this building of tension. What an amazing way to introduce a new monster. The first time I played this bit, I let out a little yell, and the thing is, this bit is so good, they kept it in the remake. So I'd played that already. I already knew it was coming, and I still jumped when the licker crawled over the window, and I felt this awful building dread as I moved into the corridor. These shots are so effective, they're still scary to someone who knows it's coming, and they were so effective at creating the feeling for people that the image I'm using here is literally from the Wikipedia entry about fixed camera angles in games. It's fair to say Resident Evil 2, at least, is an iconic use of fixed camera angles. There'll be plenty more of this in the game design episode, but I think I've said enough now to demonstrate that the type of horror Resident Evil favors is closer to the jump scare than existential dread or psychological horror. you can rest assured that Leon Kennedy is never going to fight a monster of his undead wife turning into his mother, or awake from a dream to realize he was in a coma for 17 years. Resident Evil's horror is spooky in ways that, as I already said, might appear cheap at first glance. However, I hope that with a bit more exploration, we might see it as smarter and richer than it first appears. So that's what this video is really about. Fear. I think there are a few different types of people watching this right now. Some of you absolutely show up here to see my new outfits and watch my mouth move until I make sex jokes, and that is valid. Some of you, I think, haven't played the Resident Evil games and probably never will, but don't worry, I've got you covered. I hope I can give you enough interesting talking points that people will never be able to tell you haven't played them. There are going to be girls messaging each other on Grindr after this, both pretending to have played Resi 3 Nemesis to impress each other. And I'm just glad to get to be a part of that. Some of you are looking to play the games, but find the franchise big and intimidating. But don't worry, I have you covered too. I'm going to talk about how to approach the franchise and discuss easier and harder entry points. Was that one of those sex jokes? Who knows? Lastly, there are people who have played the Resident Evil games and are still confused. So you've sought out your favourite internet niche micro-celebrity for help. And I think that's very mature of you. Admitting you have a problem is the first step. I hope that in this episode we're going to wind up understanding Resident Evil as a horror game franchise, and to that end I want us to primarily understand the way it handles fear. I also want to look at the franchise from a game design perspective because it's been going for 25 years at this point, and with such a strong start, such a desperately dire middle period, and such a powerful revival in recent years, the game design of the franchise is its own story. And as for politics, believe me when I say that the politics of this series are fucking buck wild, and we will get there when we get there. Noah Caldwell-Gervais's video, A Thorough Look at Resident Evil, is, of course, an incredible analysis, an impressive feat of gargantuan video essayship, and is full of good takes. I personally prefer to separate my takes into different topics, different perspectives, rather than having game design alongside politics, alongside critical reception, and so on. That's just a stylistic difference. I've seen Noah's video all the way through more times than possibly anybody else, and at the least I've seen it through too many times not to recommend it here. So, to start repeating Noah's points, when the first Resident Evil was in development, Tokuro Fujiwara hired Shinji Mikami to develop his horror game because Shinji Mikami couldn't handle horror at all. Fujiwara wanted someone who saw horror with fresh eyes and would be terrified of the game he was making. That was then, and continues to be now, a huge strength of the horror of Resident Evil, and it also explains why it relies on so much, as I said earlier, scary things being shown to you on screen in front of your eyes. Someone who is scared of zombies and snakes and spiders doesn't need to delve deeper into the world of horror to explore fear. Throughout the series, the details of what's going on the screen are so slavishly in service of what will be scary, what will make you afraid, and what will produce the greatest spectacle, that much of the actual plot of the games is near incomprehensible gibberish. Take, for example, one of the main antagonists of the series, Albert Wesker. Wesker is a mercenary backstabber involved with a science project in Resident Evil 1. He's kind of pathetic and a traitor and a bit of a loser, and then he disappears for 2 games, and when he next appears, he's a superhuman mastermind arch-villain climbing his way towards ultimate power. And then he disappears for another whole game, and finally reappears as a Bond villain-style antagonist who wants to infect everyone in the world with the zombie viruses in order to make a new world in his image. Does his arc make sense? No. Does it have to? Also no. Nonetheless, with the lofty goal of understanding Resident Evil in mind, we are about to dive into summary. But first, a word on behalf of our sponsors. The whole Resimania series is sponsored by Boxu. Boxu is a Japanese snack subscription service that sends you a monthly package of Japanese snacks. Naturally, when they got in touch, I thought they'd be a perfect fit for this series. Ooh. It has this handy leaflet that tells you about all the snacks you're getting, and actually tells you where they come from as well. Corn tea. Nat, you tried this, right?
Yeah, it's really nice.
Boxu makes such a perfect and memorable gift for anyone in your life who appreciates Japanese food and culture, especially in a time when people aren't able to travel the world as easily as they would like. And actually, American subscribers to Boxu will be getting the chance to win free tickets to Japan because Boxu is holding a giveaway. They'll be picking one lucky US-based winner for a free set of tickets, and anyone who subscribed before the 31st of December is entered automatically, even if it's a gift subscription. This is the real crowning jewel of this particular box, peach mochi. Oh, so good. Do you live in the US? Do you love snacks? My YouTube analytics tell me at least one of those is quite likely. So if you want the chance to win free tickets to Japan, or just to try these great snacks, use my code MARS10 or the link in the description and you'll get 10% off your subscription. Don't miss out on this great opportunity for anyone who subscribed before December 31st. Okay, Resident Evil 1.
Resident Evil.
Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, and their pals from the STARS task force rock up to the Spencer Mansion. What is STARS? The police. What is the Spencer Mansion? Fuck you. This team is here looking for a missing team who it transpires have been turned into living dead. Woo, spooky! As the team progresses through the mansion, they realize there's more here to worry about than just the zombies. There are giant tarantulas, a mutated tentacle monster plant, a huge snake, angry chompy sharks, and of course, American police officers' natural battlefield enemy, some dogs. As well as Chris and Jill, there's Albert Wesker, Brad the helicopter pilot, and Barry and Rebecca. Though you could say there's Barry or Rebecca depending on who you play as. Many Resident Evil games have A and B playthroughs where you play as different characters, but where Resident Evil 1 is unusual is that it has fully different endings depending on your actions in the game. None of them are quite canon, but the best ending where the most people survive is basically the closest one and the only one I'll talk about here. The mansion itself is a winding, absurd, labyrinthine, esoteric puzzle, giving way to a secret underground facility and the revelation that all these monsters were actually made in a lab with the expressed purpose of creating weaponized, mutating viruses. There's also some kind of a Nosferatu Dracula in the tomb, but I don't know whether that's just still a zombie or... Okay, see, if it's a Dracula and Umbrella has the technology to manufacture Draculas, they really should have made more Draculas in all the later games as bioweapons. Maybe they were too labor-intensive to be market viable. Here the game does something really clever and interesting. Through the whole mansion, you've been battling different kinds of enemies who are just put there to be spooky, specifically to be spooky to Shinji Mikami. And as you've been moving from area to area, you've been thinking about all these different kinds of enemies, puzzling over the situation you find yourself in, and at the same time, the mansion has given you puzzles to solve for that respite, time to think. So why are all these Draculas and Zombos and plant monsters here all together? Well, they're spooky monsters. They were made in a lab, designed to spook you. This is a haunted house, and they are the scary monsters the haunted house has been populated with for the benefit of you, the player. Why are they explaining where the monsters come from? For consistency? To make a congruent and coherent world? So that the entries on residentevil.fandom.com will be easy to curate? No. They want to break the tension at the end of the haunted house experience, and understanding the show you've put on is the best way to defang the horror of the rest of the game. So, in the lab, Wesker reveals he's a traitor and a sellout, and shows Chris the ultimate life form, the Tyrant, a special kind of zombie some people turn into if they're a Sigma male, the rarest male type. The Tyrant busts out of its tube and messes up Wesker's guts, and then chases you out to the helicopter pad where the rest of the STARS team helps you escape. To defeat the undefeatable Tyrant, however, you can't just use any of your normal weapons. You'll need to blow his whole entire body off with a rocket launcher. Now, if you want to sound like you've played the game, remember, your favorite bit is when Chris laughs at the ultimate life form. That's everyone's favorite bit, but it's not in any of the synopses.
Is this?
That's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant!
This, too, is part of Resident Evil's haunted house experience. Once you've beaten all the spooks and scares and escaped the evil maze itself, the game gives you this last spectacle as a release from the tension the way a well-structured and responsible haunted house should.
Resident Evil 2.
Resident Evil 2 picks up the stories of two different characters, Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the sister of Chris Redfield from the previous game. Claire is looking for her big brother, and Leon is just showing up for his first day of work, fresh out of the police academy, graduated top of his class with a special commendation in dog shooting and evidence planting. Unfortunately, they're about to find out that life in Raccoon City isn't all it's cracked up to be. The whole city has been overrun by zombies, and the police department is empty because all the police were anti-vaccine so got infected right away. Leon and Claire are separated and reunited over and over and over across the course of the game, as Claire tries to protect an annoying little girl called Sherry Birkin, and Leon encounters a mysterious woman in a red dress called Ada Wong. It turns out Ada is looking for her lover, and Sherry is the daughter of two scientists who work in the secret research facility under the police station. It says in my script here, so there you go. If you wanted to know where they manufacture the virus, it's under the police station. Can I make this joke without my video getting taken down? Only time will tell. The biggest conceptual innovation of this game, however, is that instead of just one boss fight with a tyrant at the end, mere moments after introducing the hefty lad, in this game, a tyrant appears repeatedly, and you have to fight him again and again, using a ton of ammo to just knock him down, not even kill him, or just run away. Mr. X, the new tyrant, has been sent by Umbrella to destroy evidence of their crimes, because as it turns out, the T-Virus was released upon Raccoon City deliberately. The reason this refinement is so cool is it gives a better story structure to what is fundamentally a near-identical game. Now, that one particular guy in a trench coat can run backstage to different rooms and be there as you traverse the haunted house. It makes you feel like there's more of a progression, more of a core antagonism throughout, which drives up to that moment where you get another rocket launcher and blow another big man to smithereens. Capcom know what women want. The developers were clearly proud of this idea, so proud in fact that they put it in the game twice. Sherry's father, William Birkin, is a scientist responsible for the development of a new and improved mutagenic virus, which he's doing a fabulous job of showcasing himself as he turns into an eldritch eyeball nightmare. William shows up throughout the game again and again, pursuing the protagonists, which is honestly a weakness of Resident Evil 2 because it makes the game a bit messy. Again, if you want people to think you actually played this one, that's a great talking point to hit because not many people like to criticize RE2. You'll seem discerning.
Resident Evil 3.
I noticed something interesting while trying to, legally purchase vintage copies of the original games and play them on their original consoles. On different consoles and in different regions, Resident Evil 1 and 2, or Biohazard 1 and 2 as they're actually called in Japan, have different cover art. That's pretty typical in marketing, trying out different branding for different demographics to find the most popular one. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, however, has one cover, and it's just the Nemesis. The big, chunky boy who's coming to kill you. Noah made this point in his video as well. In the Resident Evil movie franchise, they're bad, do not watch them. Not much is kept the same, just disparate elements and characters put through a blender. But Nemesis is exactly the same, because you can't improve on perfection. Here, the series iterated on the idea of Mr. X in the most perfect way possible by having the new boss monster chase you all the way through the game with only brief windows of respite. In Resident Evil 3, Jill Valentine from the STARS team in the first game is being hunted by a mutated hitman sent by Umbrella to tie up loose ends. This is the Nemesis, a great big boy who goes everywhere you go. And that's when I knew this was a series designed for women.
Everybody says stay away from Nemesis, but I gotta get the little kiss, just cause it kinda embarrassing. Doesn't mean he's not the man for me, but it's like stay away from Nemesis. You know he isn't what it says, but they can't see what I can see. A big, big man who's coming for me, he's got drive, he's got ambition. He would follow you to the ends of the earth. He's so tall and he's frightening. I could fix him, yeah, yeah. Nemesis, Give me your call, 'cause I like to risk it all. I know you're a major enemy, but how about a little date with me? Yes, he wants to kill you, I get it, I know, but the thing about Nemesis is he's kinda sexy though. Everybody say stay away from Nemesis.
Let's talk about the haunted house design a little bit more. This is a perfect thing to introduce to this franchise's haunted house approach to fear and horror, because what could make a haunted house more scary than being chased through it, unable to get your breath, unable to set your own pace, but also, this is something video games can do that a haunted house really can't pull off. Because, like, what would the guy do when he caught you? Wave his arms around? Growl? And then what? You'd be fine, and you'd have to carry on through the house unharmed. The whole illusion would be shattered to pieces, because you know thoroughly and completely he won't do anything if he catches you. By contrast, the Nemesis can catch you and can kill you in all sorts of ways, and all he wants to do is kill you, and he kills Brad! No! Brad! Who will fly the helicopter now? Capcom really struck gold here. It's part of the original trilogy before the remakes. Resi 3 is, for my money, the best game. Look, you've killed every other tyrant in this series so far with a rocket launcher. Not only do you not have a rocket launcher to kill the Nemesis, but the Nemesis does! He's got a rocket launcher! In the remake, they even introduce Carlos by having him appear suddenly with a rocket launcher. Oh, my hero! But Nemesis just catches the rocket in mid-air with his tentacle. I love him so much. So the story of Resident Evil 3 really ties together the first trilogy beautifully. Jill is on the run from Nemesis, and Carlos is a mercenary working for Umbrella's armed militia. A normal thing for a pharmaceutical company to have. Carlos is a fundamentally good guy. He just doesn't seem to realize that the company he works for is responsible for all the shit going on around him, which, fair enough, nobody else seems to realize that either. He thinks that he's there to help and get survivors out, but really, his whole team is on a similar errand to the Nemesis, sent to stop Jill. The human antagonist here is Nikolai, a mercenary working on Carlos's team, who, like Wesker, was working towards the Umbrella Corporation's goals, and also, like Wesker, reveals his evil schemes in the third act. In the original, he gets away, but I prefer the ending of the remake, where he's destroyed by his own hubris, because it's also like Wesker. It reminds us of the first game. It's like poetry, it rhymes. It follows a very similar progression to the other games in terms of setting, puzzles, navigation, combat, and encounter design, and so on, but the basic fact of being chased by Nemesis adds so much flair to the player's experience. Cities, buildings, sewers, underground lab, final fight, big escape, and all through all of it, fighting Nemesis again and again and again. And in the remake, he even takes on more absurdly monstrous forms as he comes back, making it frustrating when you think you've beaten him, and even more satisfying when you get to whip out your big girl gun and blow a hole right through his entire existence. The final stage of the game comes with the news that the government is going to nuke Raccoon City in order to wipe out the zombie plague and prevent further outbreak. At first glance, this is just hilariously American, nuking a city to stop the spread of a disease. But if you think about it a bit more, you just spent the last 2 whole games trying to protect evidence of Umbrella's crimes as they tried to make sure they didn't leave any traces. And now the government just, sterilized every shred of evidence left. On the one hand, Jill and Carlos do manage to get out with some evidence. They can testify against them, and the game tells us that Umbrella does get shut down. But on the other hand, there are big hanging questions here. If a company is powerful enough to build huge underground facilities under the whole city and release a zombie plague just to provide cover as they send 2 huge hulking mutant super zombies to go cover their tracks, what other bigger secrets do they have that you'd never even found out about? That question is basically the lead that brings us into the second Resident Evil trilogy, which is, I think, where a lot of people get lost. for several pretty good reasons. Now is as good a time as any to talk about characterization in the franchise. The franchise is made up of installments that were released years apart, with years of fans replaying the game, having discussions, getting hyped in between, which means that when you play them all back to back, the characters have this absurd level of fanfare and glorified framing that seems really bizarre, leaving you with the constant feeling like when you start watching a new YouTuber and they have a long-running character you're expected to already be familiar with. Isn't that right, CIA femboy? Invading Afghanistan is bussy! No, it isn't. The characterization gives the whole series a bit of a weird vibe, which doesn't really deter players on its own, but it will be something to bear in mind going into the middle period of Resi games. Speaking of weird vibes, one of the distinctly odd things about Resident Evil is the weird vibe of the world, or more specifically, of Raccoon City. Raccoon City is a place out of time and foreign to everyone, emulating Americana, and yet not quite American. In that way, this vibe works really well in displacing what the games are about, their explicit messaging, onto a fictional world that is similar enough to make sense to us, but alien enough that it comes across as a critique of systems rather than specific individuals. And what are the first 3 games actually about? Well, they're basically about what you'd expect 3 games made in the 90s featuring a zombie plague manufactured by a pharmaceutical corporation to be about. The evils of corporate America, the authoritarian creep of the power of big business, global capitalism, and the military-industrial complex. The Umbrella Corp is manufacturing bioweapons capable of destroying whole cities or even more, and when they're uncovered, they demonstrate the ruthless effectiveness of their creations. As many secrets are being discovered about Umbrella, many more are hidden or lost as Raccoon City is sterilized in atomic fire, and you're left to wonder, just how deep does this thing go? And in that way, the first RE trilogy is, as the kids say, fucking based. Unfortunately, they're also wriggling, craven, pathetic propaganda. Almost every protagonist in the franchise is some stripe of cop. And as the conspiracies of the Umbrella Corporation's evil schemes are uncovered, the games follow the familiar one good cop against a corrupt system formula of propaganda. This formula provides the audience with the easy rationalization that if only the whole police department were upstanding, reliable folks like Leon S. Kennedy, everything would be alright. Where in reality, bad cops come to be bad cops not only because of systemic pressures on them, both broad in the form of biases in the culture and specific in the form of other police threatening their safety if their behavior isn't in line with the worst among them, but also because the role of police attracts people with an authoritarian personality type in the first place. Throw on top of that American police are trained by the appropriately named Dave Grossman in a seminar he calls Killology on how to be constantly angry and afraid of everything around them and ready to kill at a moment's notice, and the epidemic of police murdering black people makes more sense. It's deeper than that though, and look, I can and fully intend to get into how the modern Western police are institutionally inseparable from concepts of class warfare and racism, but in the politics episode of Resimania, this is just the episode for understanding the series. For more on propaganda, check out Jack Saint's fabulous propaganda series. For more on Killology, link in the description. But for now, on to the 4th Resident Evil game.
Resident Evil.
No, not Resident Evil 4. The 4th Resident Evil game. You thought that just because I was covering the main series, I was going to skip Resident Evil Code Veronica? No. Resident Evil Code Veronica is a ridiculous mess of a game. Originally intended to be the 3rd Resident Evil, it wound up being the 4th, but not properly in the main series. The plot is largely nonsense. The game throws a ton of new characters at you that will only matter for this game, and a bunch more that are really significant to the whole franchise, completely indiscriminately, so fast your head will spin. I'll leave out as much as I can, because you're here to understand Resident Evil, not hear me complain about Steve for 2 hours, but let it be known, I could complain about Steve for 2 hours.
Don't worry, Claire. Your knight in shining armor is here.
He's one of the 3 sinners being chewed in Satan's mouths at the bottom level of the Inferno. God, does this guy ever suck. I don't know how someone makes every single voice line from a character as aggravating as possible, but it must take a special talent.
Hey, I was just kidding.
It's toxic gas!
He won't come. You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others.
Wait!
What's going on? Huh? You're not a zombie. See you around, Claire. Adios.
They even managed to take one of the zombie story staple tropes of, oh no, someone I love has turned and I don't want to shoot them even though they are a danger to me, and managed to make it...
I can't! No!
Steve! No! Ah!
Father! Ah!
So annoying that from there all I can think about any time this happens again in Resident Evil, I can only see Steve's melodramatic whining.
I can't! No!
Steve is suffering. Good. Right from the opening cinematic, Code Veronica is a fucking nightmare to follow. First, there's a text crawl about Claire and Chris in Raccoon City, and then helicopters flying to an island. And then Claire is knocked out and it cuts back in time to an action sequence of her being captured in Umbrella's research facility in Paris, and then forward again to Claire in jail on the island, but in the next cutscene she is immediately freed by an unnamed guy with a zombie bite because...
May as well know you have no chance of getting off this island.
As for the gameplay, Code Veronica has puzzles, but they suck. Like, an area you have to put all your metal items in a special box to enter, or a deceptively simple console where you literally have to play match the shapes and just press the two buttons with guns on them. I spent so long going, it can't just be that you press the two guns, and then when it actually was, I didn't feel like I'd solved a puzzle. I felt like I'd been trolled.
That was too close. But I found something, thanks to you.
The game also has enemies, and they kind of suck too. They're better than the puzzles, but nothing as beautifully thought through as the Lickers in Resi 2, or memorable as the Tyrants. It's just a bunch of zombies on an island, and that's kind of it. I wish they wouldn't do the heartbeat thing, because it does make me feel like I'm about to fucking drop dead. It's unhelpful, I think. The game is awful to play in ways that I could, and I guess I will, spend way too long dissecting later in this series, but for our purposes now, it's enough to say that after struggling through the tank controls and the frustrating scarcity of items and ammo in this weird game that can't decide if it wants to commit to action or puzzles, I finally just quit when I reached the graveyard and I simply didn't have the health to survive fighting a completely banal mid-level enemy and wouldn't be able to progress without fully reverting back to an earlier save. And I'm mad as hell about it too, because I love Claire Redfield. I think she's a really fun character. Anyone who wears hot pink double denim in the apocalypse is fucking iconic. Code Veronica is really bad. Don't play it, but also, sadly, it's really important to the series' continuity. For instance, it contains the reveal that Albert Wesker is still alive and faked his death, and he's a witcher and he's been stealing all of Geraldo Riviera's potions to make him super fast and strong and have, like, cat eyes.
I'm a witcher.
He, like all witches, was taken at a young age to be trained in the witcher secrets so he can take over the world? No, I'm not sure Gerald would approve. This is all-important setup, because where the first trilogy focuses largely on the idea of genetic modification for the purposes of biological warfare, the second trilogy seeks to expand its scope, and not just to the world outside Raccoon City, but forward and backwards in time as well. And to do that, in Code Veronica, the writers backfill a lot of the history of this program and the wider conspiracy it's a part of. In short, what the second trilogy focuses on more explicitly is eugenics. And that's the other big thing you need to take from Code Veronica.
I can't! No!
Resident Evil 4.
Resident Evil 4 was in development for a long time. A lot of people like to say development hell, but personally I think it's hell when your work is released to the general public and uninformed, dirty little opinionated peasants tell you what they think of it. By contrast, development stage can be quite nice, as long as you aren't working under a system that values profit more than human life. Okay, maybe hell is the right word. Notoriously, one of the attempts at creating Resident Evil 4 became a hugely successful Capcom franchise in its own right, Devil May Cry. I think that speaks to the kind of form Capcom were on when they came to making Resident Evil 4, but it also speaks to a desire to change what the series was fundamentally about. That's a huge part of why they spent 6 years developing 4 different versions of the game, and when they did finally release it, why Resident Evil 4 was so noticeably different from everything that came before it. Resi 4, by general gamer consensus, is a masterpiece. A lot of people still hold it up as the best Resident Evil game, and it basically shaped the mold into which action horror titles like it would be poured from then onwards. Capcom had quite firmly done it again, striking gold twice in the same series in a way that franchises rarely manage, and creating a genre-defining game to kick off the second trilogy. It is incredible that this game could be the first in a trilogy that also contains RE5 and RE6. Shocking, even. We could talk more about the other versions of RE4 that Capcom tried to develop, but an interesting commonality between them is that it was always going to be about Leon Kennedy going on a very James Bond meets Wolfenstein adventure into Europe to the castle-like headquarters of Umbrella, or in other versions, simply a castle owned by Oswald Spencer, the Spencer of the Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil 1. The intentions for this trilogy were there from the beginning to dig deeper into the conspiracy of power and eugenics and unholy science that caused everything in the first trilogy. The ability to communicate any of that information clearly, however, was not. When you get to the end of Resident Evil 5... Fuck. I recorded the first part of this audio like a week ago, so I'm sorry if my voice and tone sounds completely different now. It's been a while. I actually got a tattoo. You can see it appears and disappears in the footage. That's a fun Easter egg to watch out for. Have fun with that. When you get to the end of Resident Evil 5 and see Wesker talking to an old man in a dark, spooky castle, provided you simply played the games Resi 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you will have absolutely no clue who the fuck this old guy is. And you have no reason to know. But that's Oswald Spencer, the Vesemir to Wesker's Geralt, the weird old Nazi who kidnapped a bunch of kids and turned them into Catboys. All this to say that the Resident Evil 4 that was being planned might or might not have wound up being as groundbreaking as it was, but the Resident Evil 4 that we got is hard at times to link back to the originals, besides containing Leon and the intriguing reappearance of evening gown wearing super spy Ada Wong. That's okay though, isn't it? Wasn't the first game a non sequitur when it started? Just a bunch of angry animals in a house? And then Resident Evil 2 started with all new characters? It's not only a valid move, but an expected one for Resident Evil 4 to start the new trilogy with esoteric nonsense, and wind slowly towards the connecting tissue of the franchise. Leon Kennedy, massively successful from his one day of experience as a cop, has secured a job in the Secret Service, and now finds himself on a mission to an unspecified region of Spain, to a small, rural village, where the president's daughter Ashley has been kidnapped. Again, the world of Resident Evil is all non-specific and abstracted, but like, Ashley is Chelsea Clinton, right? It's in the vibe. I don't know how to explain it better. Like, the president is Bill Clinton, just in my opinion. Leon finds out that the president's daughter is being held by a cult called Los Iluminados, who worship and let themselves be controlled by a brain-eating parasite they call Las Plagas. Las Plagas has effects similar in some ways to Umbrella's bioweapons, but is apparently indigenous to the region. It turns out that Ada the cult and Jack Krauser, an ex-Special Forces pal of Leon's, are all working to secure a sample of Las Plagas so they can do all the nefarious things that you can do with a mutant Spanish mind control virus. Oh look, Leon! Another of your colleagues from the endless legions of American imperialism has turned out to be a scheming psychopath. Any conclusions you want to draw from that, Leon? Anything? Anybody? If cops are bad, why do their uniforms make them look so daddy? I wish I'd never invented you.
Resident Evil 5.
Is really racist.
Up, Daddy! What?
That's the first thing you need to know about Resident Evil 5, and since we're here to understand Resident Evil, I'd say it bears repeating. Resident Evil 5 is a racist shitshow. Here, we rejoin Chris Redfield, now with the BSAA, a task force created in response to Umbrella. Basically, imagine if the CDC had a team of Navy SEALs. Chris and his partner Shiva are in the Kijuju region of Africa. They actually called it Kijuju, and I am going to become the Joker. That's the setting. Captain America Chris Redfield blasting away angry, scary brown people in the global south. And then, as the game progresses, Captain America Chris Redfield blasting away angry, scary, tribal, savage stereotypes in the global south. This is where we need to bring back around what I was saying about the vibe of the world from before. It was important to understand how well it worked to create an abstracted Americana setting in the first trilogy, but now that same style would work against the series here. Let's talk about that, because I think it's pretty interesting. These games, I hope I have established by now, work a little bit like a haunted house. Cartoonish monsters pop out at you from the dark and give you a little fright the whole way through, and then at the end we get some very silly and hammy exposition from a guy with terrible hair about the T-virus or the G-virus or the C-virus or the ultimate life form or some other such nonsense. And we all feel a little bit better. It makes us feel better because now that we understand the monsters, we know that they exist just for our perverse enjoyment. Like the sick little freaks we are. Again and again we choose to enter the haunted house, to be shocked and spooked, and then made to feel a little bit better, and get to shoot the baddie with a great big gun, and then go home safe and sound, and have a marshmallow hot chocolate under a weighted blanket. Here, though, the source of the scares is little more than just brown people. Yes, some of them mutate and explode, revealing Las Plagas monsters inside, but many of them do not. Where the basic enemies of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 were zombies, and 4 were cultists, the people here are victims of a biochemical weapons attack. Their non-specific African country has been ravaged by centuries of colonialism, decades of war, disease, neglect by the UN, and now they're being turned into zombie-adjacent Plagas victims by the people at the heart of all the evil in the world. We should feel sorry for these people. We should get our Steve moment.
I can't! No!
But it's overwhelmingly clear that the loss of their humanity was never intended to be part of the horror because they were never assumed to have much humanity in the first place. You rock up to the haunted house and are given your ticket by Capcom and ushered inside. From the darkness springs out at you a terrifying monster. A guy! Before you have time to understand what was supposed to be scary about this guy, you're ushered into another room, where this time another guy, dressed in traditional clothing and shaking a spear at you, menaces you from the shadows. It carries on like this. You make your way out of the haunted house, experience your spectacle and your exposition, and go home tired and confused, and still not sure what was supposed to be so scary about those guys. Without further clarification from Capcom, you are left to fill in a pretty sinister blank. I think that some part of this has to do with the political vision that the franchise was trying to grapple with, and as much as I may sound like a broken record now, I will discuss Resi 5 more at length in both the game design and ideology videos of this series. It may be enough for now to say that Cyberpunk 2077, to do this kind of horror right, they would have needed to explore this topic intelligently and thoroughly, and they were simply never prepared to do that. We also get flashbacks to Jill and Chris trying to confront Wesker in a story you won't fully see unless you play DLC that was released later, where apparently one of the original main series protagonists, Jill Valentine, fucking dies in some castle? What the fuck? Now, you and I know that this is Oswald Spencer's castle that Jill and Chris went to in search of Wesker, but playing these games in the seemingly expected sequence, we're told in a flashback that Jill Valentine is apparently dead. As Chris and Sheva progress further into Kajuju in search of Ricardo Irving, a black market bioweapons dealer, they see evidence that Jill might not be dead. So, cool, I guess?
Tricell. They helped fund the BSAA. What the hell are they doing here?
Chris also finds out that, shock horror, Tricell, one of BSAA's funding sources, is tied up in the distribution of bioweapons, and furthermore, Wesker is behind Tricell. Oh look, corporations involved in foreign enforcement of American imperialism tied up in horrifying war crimes. Any lessons anyone here wants to learn? Tricell is just succeeding in the free market and ugly leftists are mad because all the hottest streamers love America. What does that even mean? I can use my Xbox controller when I fly my drone. Get out of my video essay! So how is Wesker behind Tricell? Well, the CEO of Tricell, Excella Gion, a perfect characterization of the franchise's shift away from B-horror and towards James Bond nonsense, is down bad for Wesker and thinks that if she helps him to infect the whole world with their new virus, she can be his queen. How many viruses is that now? Are you keeping track? The T-virus, the G-virus, Las Plagas, and now Ouroboros, a fitting icon for Wesker's masturbatory contrived villainous plan, the ancient symbol of the self-suck. Oh right, and Jill is evil now. Wesker fitted her with a skin-tight villain costume and taught her the Witcher secrets so she's super fast and good at fighting, and implanted her with a mind control crystal on her boobs that Chris has to manhandle off her in order to save her from it. And she's blonde now. Did I mention she's blonde? I guess it goes with the territory when you're working for a psychopathic eugenicist catboy. Chris saves Jill, kills Excella, tracks down Wesker into a fucking volcano, and finally ends his many games-long rivalry with Wesker by shooting him with, you guessed it, a rocket launcher. I can't tell you how relieved I was when this game was finally over. Actually, I figured Resident Evil 5 would be 5 sections like Resident Evil 4 was, and so when I completed Chapter 5, and Chapter 6-1 appeared on my screen, I actually started yelling. I was so sick of this fucking game by that point. Luckily though, no Resident Evil could possibly be worse, or for that matter, longer than Resident Evil 5. Huh? What's this?
Resident Evil 6.
Resident Evil 6 is one of the worst games I have ever played. Resident Evil 5 is too, if that wasn't clear, but the thing about Resident Evil 6 is, there's just so damn much of it. The concept for the game actually sounds pretty cool, especially for the end of the two trilogies. It's an anthology game with 4 different play routes, following Leon, Chris, a new character called Jake Muller, and Ada Wong. In practice, the game starts with Leon pointing a gun at the President of the United States, who has turned into a zombie, with a confusing intercut of all Leon and the President's happy times together as best friends, as Leon is reluctantly forced to pull the trigger. I can't believe they really did
I can't! No!
again, but with Leon and the President.
Mr. President!
Don't make me do this.
In theory, it sounds like a cool way to explore and wrap up the various storylines of different characters from across the franchise. In practice, you have a mediocre Leon game, followed by a shockingly bad Chris game, and even though the Jake playthrough isn't as bad as the Chris one, by the time you get to it, you're regretting all the decisions in your life that led to this, and by the time you get to the Ada playthrough, you wish for the sweet embrace of death. In theory, an anthology game is the perfect way to conclude the narrative arc of an anthology game series that's been slowly drawing together different pieces for 16 years. In practice, it fucking killed the franchise. It was fucked. 16 years of build-up and it leads to this?
Mr. President!
Before I try to synopsize it, let's talk about some of the things that it did well. The game opens with a bioterror attack on the town of Tall Oaks, where President, not Bill Clinton, was about to reveal the connections between the US government and the attack on Raccoon City. That's great for a few reasons. We finally get answers about Raccoon City, and yes, the city was nuked to cover up Umbrella's crimes, and yes, the government does have deep ties to all the insidious conspiracies driving the plot, but also, those answers are dwarfed by the looming shadow of the conspiracy itself, which casually disposes of the President of the United States like an inconvenient uncle in a mafia family. And before we go any further, here's the joke. President Evil. This game contains several impressions of this kind, visions of warfare and death in the new world that Umbrella has created. There's the Tall Oaks attack, another gas attack turning people into zombies in the fictional city of Lanxiang, China, and extended sequences of combat in a war-torn, non-specific Eastern European country where giant zombies are used as bioorganic weapons of war. It firmly creates the sense that the cat is quite irreparably out of the bag, which makes you reflect on some level back on the rest of the franchise and the way that new technology shapes the world. I also like the dual perspectives that Leon and Chris have, both pursuing Ada, though Leon is obviously down bad for her and Chris wants to kill her. It feels like a great microcosm of their characterization throughout the series. Chris has always been the gruff, grizzled veteran, constantly traumatized by the horror of the world he lives in, forever unable to leave it behind. And Leon can go from job to country, but he's always the new cop on day one, fresh out of the academy, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Jake's playthrough with Player 2 Sherry Birkin, the little girl from Resident Evil 2, is mostly structured around them being pursued by a tyrant called the Ustanak. I do like that, because as the younger generation, we get to see how these characters will go through all the same horrors as the others went through before, in a cyclical way until it's all stopped. There are pleasing and thoughtful elements in Resident Evil 6, but they are so very few, and so very far between. And in between, in order to keep up with the basic plot, you need to hold in your head. Leon Kennedy shoots the zombie president in the head, escapes Tall Oaks to a cathedral, battles a titty fart monster, goes into an underground lab, watches a VHS tape of Ada Wong being born out of a goose sack, finds Ada Wong deep in the underground caves, fights Helena's sister who's turned into a sexy scorpion demon. Derek Simmons, who orchestrated the bioterror attack on Tall Oaks, frames Leon and Helena, who escape the caves and see Tall Oaks get nuked, get on a plane to China, titty fart monster on the plane, crash land the plane, run into Jake and Sherry and the Ustanak, hunt for Simmons, find Ada Wong, meet Chris Redfield, keep hunting Simmons, Simmons goes sicko mode, city gets gas bombed, everyone is zombies, fight Simmons again, save Ada and defeats Simmons. Chris Redfield is drinking alone in a bar in Eastern Europe because war is hell. Piers shows up and gets him to come to China and shoot bug people. Flashback to why Chris is a mess. 6 months ago in Eastern Europe, he lost a lot of guys when Ada Wong infected them with the C virus. In the present, Chris remembers all this and starts hunting Ada, meets Leon, Ada escapes. Piers and Chris follow her to an aircraft carrier. Ada is making a missile to zombify the city, gets shot by a helicopter and jumps off the bridge and is dead. Chris and Piers fail to stop the missile, so go to find Jake, who has C virus antibodies, find him in an underwater lab, find an octopus man kaiju. Piers infects himself with the virus in order to beat it. Chris saves the day, but Piers dies. Jake Muller, Apple Eater, and Edgy Angry Boy meet Sherry Birkin from Resi 2, now all grown up and working for the DSO. Jake is the only one who doesn't mutate when the C virus hits, so Sherry thinks he could provide a base for a cure, which Jake says he'll give her for $50 million. Isn't the free market wonderful? Jake and Sherry are chased by the Ustanak, crash a helicopter, Sherry does a Wolverine, they run to a cottage, fight more goons, infuriating snowmobile sequence.
This is not a good idea!
Chased by the Ustanak, captured by Ada Wong, Ada reveals that Jake is Wesker's son, takes them to China, they're experimented on for 6 months, escape the facility, go looking for the DSO, captured again, Chris Redfield rescues them, they meet Leon, try to escape the city, captured again, taken to an underwater facility, Chris saves them again, Jake is mad because Chris killed Wesker, an evil fascist prick who would have been a terrible father if Jake had ever met him, which he didn't. Jake gets over it, Sherry and Jake flee the facility, fight the Ustanak, kill the Ustanak, Jake gives Sherry some of his blood but only asks for $50 for it instead of $50 million because he's nice now. Ada Wong is an underworld super spy who gets a lead from Derek Simmons, taking her to a submarine where she sees that she was given orders 6 months earlier to capture Jake Muller in Eastern Europe, which apparently she did but she doesn't remember, and eventually she finds out that Simmons turned a woman called Carla into a second fake Ada. So she goes to China, finds her doppelganger, fights her doppelganger, kills her doppelganger, and then helps Leon kill Simmons and destroys the last of the evil shit that Simmons and Carla were doing together. So, how did all of that wrap up the plot that's been building for 5 games now? Good question! Did I mention that the evil corporation pursuing the heroes is called Neo Umbrella? I know that I didn't because I wrote a script where I deliberately withheld the information until now, but just take a second for... Holy shit! Neo Umbrella! What? I sincerely did not think that I would ever hate a character quite as much as Steve, but then there was Jake fucking Muller. Chris's playthrough is actually, by most sensible metrics, the worst of the 4, but because you play it either first or more likely second, Jake and Ada's playthroughs are both beyond the point of total nightmarish exhaustion, and Jake's personality is just so absurdly grating that in terms of the experience, Jake's playthrough is genuinely the low point of the entire franchise. Look, Resident Evil isn't a franchise where characters are, like, deep. When they work because they're simple, but simple, not just flat. Jake Muller has all the character development, depth, and nuance of Shadow the fucking Hedgehog.
You're a beta male, Sonic.
I think the real death of Resident Evil and Resi 6 comes from a failure to appreciate where the creators' strengths and weaknesses were. Resi 6 was an extremely ambitious project, with different teams working on all of the different character storylines, but there's not a clear vision that really brings it all together. In earlier games, the top priorities were scares, spectacle, and sensation, but at this point in the franchise, trying to bring everything together for a neat ending, they focused more on trying to match the scope of the conspiracy they were describing than on creating a game that was engaging to play, and they completely fucked it. Resident Evil was dead. The purifying atomic disaster waves of the fallout of Resi 6 blasted the T-Virus, G-Virus, Plagas, Progenitor, and C-Virus almost completely from the face of the Earth. But here's the thing about a virus. If you don't get all of it, it can mutate and come back stronger. Ethan Winters, the faceless protagonist of Resident Evil 7, is drawn to a house somewhere in the Louisiana wetlands because his wife Mia, who has been missing, presumed dead for 3 years, is somehow alive and trapped in the basement of the Baker family. Ethan breaks in, finds Mia, who immediately goes fucking sicko mode on him and cuts his hand off with a chainsaw. Ethan then gets the honor of meeting the Baker family father Jack, who brutally murders him. Well, that was a quick game. No, well, somehow you're brought back to life and get to meet the rest of the family. Lucky you! There are several important things going on here. Firstly, following in the footsteps of other games that want to tell you how insignificant you are and how afraid you should be, like Bloodborne, Resident Evil 7 starts the game by killing you. It's pretty simple, but hella effective. It's like the design trick I talked about earlier with the Nemesis. In a real haunted house, the monsters can't hurt you. But in a video game, they can chase you around, throw you through walls, cut off your hand, murder you, and then bring you back to life, and it's all peachy. Mia is acting like the Bakers are her real family, clearly flipping between delusional and lucid spells, and what's great about this is how it builds the powerful levels of what the fuck is happening, and at the same time makes the story you actually have to engage with fairly simple, perfectly clear. This is hillbilly horror. You're going to meet your wife's family, and they are sadistic, unhinged, homicidal swamp people. Are they her real family? No, and we'll get to that, but it doesn't matter, because that's just the kind of haunted house this is. It's the meet the folks. They want to force feed you rotting food and chase you around the house with an axe haunted house. It's perfect. And speaking of the house, thirdly, it's a big house again! They've brought us right back to the classics to save the franchise from the bloated mess it had become. Jake Muller's apple-eating angstfest is no more. Welcome to Shinji's Mansion 2, Spookio Drift, puzzles, zombies, insects, mold men. Yes! Yes! In and around the house, there's Jack, his wife Marguerite, who is a terrifying bug woman who chases you in the crawl space under the house, basically Nope personified. Their son Lucas, who smoked too much rave music and did too much internet at an early age, so he's a psychopathic, sadistic millennial who likes to trap people in his maze to watch them torture themselves and die. It's a Saw homage, which I didn't expect to land with me, because, Saw, but it really did. It probably does Saw better than Saw does. There's also an elderly woman in a wheelchair who never moves or speaks, but somehow follows you around the house just to do little jump scares. And last but not least, Zoe, who isn't like the others. Somehow, she's survived and prevented whatever happened to the rest of the family from happening to her. So Jack chases you around the whole game, boss fight and then spectacular death, and you think you beat him, but how the fuck is he still alive? Rinse and repeat. He takes on the role of the tyrant, the nemesis. Marguerite is the second big boss fight after you escape Jack a few times, and she is absolutely terrifying. I'm not the most insectophobic, but I do get Nat to take out big spiders that I find in the bathtub. It's not the insects that Marguerite shrouds herself with and basically becomes later that really make her scary, though, in my opinion. It's the way that she basically just wants to be left alone. She's a perfect inversion from Jack, who chases you through the house. Yeah, she'll kill you if she sees you, but she just plain doesn't like you and doesn't want you around. It's unsettling, and it's a great dynamic for this meet the folks horror. Dad wants to kick your ass, Mom doesn't like you, their weird son wants to play his weird games with you. After the Marguerite boss fight, Lucas's maze is actually a bit of a relief. I wouldn't say there's nothing scary to it, but it did feel like the game was consciously giving me breathing room. Congrats, you survived the bug woman. Here, have a wacky edgelord puzzle boy. Case in point, there's a room full of balloons in the first part of Lucas's birthday party themed maze, and you can pop them with the candle flame you're carrying, and that was just uncomplicatedly fun. What a nice little bit in the middle of all this horror. So you eventually developed 2 doses of a serum to whatever the fuck the people that you can save Zoe and Mia with, but you have to use one of the serum doses on Jack in his final eldritch form, which leads you to a choice between curing the wife you came here to save and the woman who has been helping you throughout the game. The ending splits here, making you choose between Zoe and Mia, but not really, because if you save Zoe, she'll be killed in like 10 minutes and you'll have to kill Mia as well. Like with the original Resident Evil, the best ending is the one that'll be carried forward into the next game, and there's even a DLC storyline for this game called The End of Zoe that presumes you chose to save Mia. Really, the choice here is a moment to do with trust and connection that can result in a fail state or the real ending of the game, rather than properly split endings. From here, the horror really starts to ramp back up, as you explore a crashed tanker in the middle of the swamp. The crew are either horrifyingly suffocated by a slick black liquid spilling out of the ship, or have transformed into mold men like you met earlier in the game. You're starting to get a sense of why the Bakers might be like this. It turns out that Mia was working for an unnamed corporation that was also developing bioweapons. In this instance, a bioweapon called Evelyn. Evelyn is a little girl with mold powers. What do mold powers entail? Well, pretty much whatever you want, really. That's what makes her such an effective weapon. That, and being a little girl who is easily manipulated by adults. Unfortunately, that also makes her a terrifying thing to lose control of. So, how did the Baker family get like this? Well, they're basically the playthings of this little girl, masquerading as the old woman in the wheelchair. She wanted a family, so she's made them hers, and incorporated Mia, and wanted to incorporate Ethan too if she could. Once again, we see that the haunted house was all made for us. The Bakers aren't so scary, really. They're just ordinary people who were warped and twisted by this biochemical spill. And who is the little girl? I think in some sense, she's Shinji Mikami. Or, if it works better to say this, she is the heart of the franchise. Evelyn has incredible powers. She can do anything she wants, make anything she wants. And what she chooses to make, what she needs more than anything else, is to make a spooky haunted house, to trap passers-by and scare the Christ out of them. She is the Resident Evil. So the ending is a bit weird. You fight Evelyn, and with the aid of an unseen ally in a helicopter, you defeat her. And then, your rescuer drops down and reveals he's Chris Redfield. which, okay, very cool, tying everything back in. And then we see the side of the helicopter has an Umbrella Corporation logo. What? Well, it seems like Umbrella is a new organization dedicated to fixing the world, but we'll see. The series is taking things in a new direction, and we'll just have to wait and see. It certainly feels like this is more of that propaganda shit. Look, here's the good organization where the good guys work, and they're gonna make everything good. But it'll probably turn out to be evil again anyway. We'll just have to wait and see. Ethan, on the other hand, isn't reticent about Umbrella at all. As the helicopter flies away, Ethan confidently tells us,
"But now Evelyn's dead. And these guys are here to clean up the mess."
And I am just flabbergasted. Now, although I love it, I wouldn't suggest starting with this game for 3 reasons. Firstly, it is quite clearly, head and shoulders, by a wide margin, the scariest game in the franchise. Now, you might think you want that, but I don't think you do. But you might think you do, but I don't. Secondly, it is, in my opinion, and I know this will be a little controversial, the best game in the franchise. And you should get to enjoy it at an appropriate stage, instead of starting with the best one and having only downhill to go from there. Thirdly, a lot of what is so good about Resi 7 is where it builds off the rest of the franchise's successes. It might just be me, but I think you'll appreciate Resident Evil 7 a lot more if you know what it's doing there. For example, the whole thread of the healing liquid and the green herbs and the mold man in this game takes inspiration from the classic healing item, green herb, in the originals, which was never explained or expanded upon. Like, it's just, I don't know, some kind of green herb that makes you feel good. Oh. But if you know about the green herb, it's like Resi 7 is saying, hey, how come that green herb could just, like, magically cure wounds? Isn't that kind of spooky itself? Let's explore that idea. Resident Evil 8, or Resident Evil Village, picks up a few years after the end of the previous game, now in Eastern Europe. And as these games go, it's actually a relatively simple one. The haunted house format is back. Once again, we have a collected assortment of spooks and scares in a puzzle box map that will eventually lead to some kind of explanation, climax, spectacle, and release. The story is that Ethan's wife is shot and his baby is taken, and he has to fight through different areas of the village controlled by 4 bosses referred to as lords. And then, when he does, Chris comes in again to airstrike the town and deal with the giant mold monster that's behind the whole thing. Like I said, it's pretty simple narratively, and conceptually it's even pretty similar to the last game, with what turns out to be another bioweapon mold villain controlling and mutating everyone. I say that this is reviving the haunted house experience again because that simple narrative is a vehicle to slot in a variety show of different kinds of gothic horror. The meat of the game comes from the chapters divided between the different lords. So let's talk about these bosses. First, of course, is Lady Dimitrescu, the vampire mommy that everyone was obsessed with getting choked by or stepped on or murdered by for like 6 months.
Yes, mother. Yes, mother.
Sadly, she isn't actually as much of the game as the marketing made her out to be. Castle Dimitrescu is significant, but it's far from the whole game. Lady Dimitrescu is the vampire side of our gothic horror show, combining all the classics from Dracula. Aristocrat, lives in a castle, has 3 vampire wives, with the original lesbian power of the vampire classic Carmilla. She's also transgender. What's that? Canonically, in the game, there's a bit of a monster woman trope in some Japanese media. You can see this with Simone in Nier Automata, where the woman has a monstrous form later in the fight, where she reveals some kind of terrifying beast under her skirt. And I hope I don't have to delve deep into the psychosexual recesses of the minds of game developers to explain to you how that relates to trans women. All I'm saying is, if they can use this tired old transphobic trope, I can call Lady Dimitrescu trans, and nobody can stop me. The second boss is Donna Beneviento, who wears a black veil and hides behind her doll Angie, so I guess kind of Angie is the boss. This is definitely the scariest part of the game, and I wouldn't say it has a clear direct inspiration in classic gothic horror, but it is very gothic. It feels very Edgar Allan Poe to me. Beneviento's chapter begins with Ethan putting a photo of Mia in through the door of her house and then going inside where he gets mugged by a doll? I don't know. This is very funny to me because Ethan seems to keep demonstrating that he isn't very bright, and this moment where the lights go out and then a doll stole all his weapons just seems like so much to me. Ethan is locked in the basement of the house with a life-sized doll of Mia containing clues and pieces to let him out. But when he eventually unlocks all the doors, he starts hearing baby noises, and then a horrifying Cronenbergian baby monster calling him daddy and trying to eat him waddles out of the dark at him. Upstairs in the house again, you have to find Angie the doll and kill her, and then you manage to escape Beneviento's illusion. I think it was an illusion. It's not totally clear. She might have dosed Ethan while the lights were out and it was all just a hallucination, but it was definitely scary as hell. Ultimately, the uncertainty of what exactly was happening or what has happened makes this chapter much scarier. All you really know is that you're in her house and you're playing her game. After the height of the horror, the game settles back into a more relaxed format. The third boss isn't really scary, more just sad. Moreau's inspiration is right there in the name. The Island of Dr. Moreau, an H.G. Wells book about a doctor who creates horrible hybrid monsters, and Moreau is a fishman who is desperate to impress Mother Miranda and be loved by her. What's so sad about Moreau is the way he fits into Miranda's family. Dimitrescu and Heisenberg compete for the top spot, Beneviento keeps to herself playing with her dolls, but Moreau just wants to do whatever will make Miranda love him, and honestly, if he wasn't in the way, I think everyone would rather just let him splash about in his lake. But he is in the way, so he has to be defeated. Heisenberg's chapter is the longest, even bigger than Castle Dimitrescu, and Ethan finds himself thrown down into the deepest depths of Heisenberg's cyborg factory. Heisenberg seems a near-perfect fit for Victor Frankenstein, but instead of making just one man, he's making hundreds, maybe thousands. And instead of making werewolves like Miranda, he's making techno-men, because you don't know me, I want to do my own thing, it'll be really cool, you'll see. The pure Nick Cage energy that Neil Newborn gives in his performance as Heisenberg is just spectacular.
You and me, Ethan. Together, we go save Rose, and we can use her to grind Miranda into paste.
Nick Cage as a Nazi Victor Frankenstein who hates his mom and just can't stop calling her
that bitch Miranda
is a truly top form Resident Evil character design. In fact, I think he's on par with Lady Dimitrescu as a character that makes this game really great. Last, Ethan goes to fight Mother Miranda, the leader of the family ruling this village, and we get the backstory of this whole place. Miranda was a biologist who discovered the mold and infected others with it in a series of experiments, eventually creating the four lords of the village and her werewolf army. She took Ethan's baby to experiment on her because she's the offspring of the mold. Oh, did I not mention that? See how Ethan has been being smacked around all over the place and getting stabbed and shot all the time? And how he gets his hand cut off and he just sticks it back on again and dribbles healing fluid on it and it's fine? Wow. No! 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 Come on, man! Come on! Come on! Come on! As if!
Good.
Come on! Come on! Come on! No! Absolutely fucking not! No! Fucking bullshit! Absolutely not! No! Jesus fucking Christ! No! Fuck that! Absolutely not! No! Fucking stop it! No bullshit. Fuck off. No. No way. Absolutely not. Okay, let's carry on. Remember the healing fluid from last game and how the Bakers were all mold people? And remember when Jack Baker just straight up fucking killed Ethan at the start of the game? Yeah. Ethan's mold now. So Ethan kills Miranda, Chris kills the fungus under the village, and then Ethan sacrifices himself in a contrived and frustrating way that makes no sense, but the cinematic language of the game tells us this is very heroic and noble. And then in a scene set many years later, we see baby Rosemary all grown up at Ethan's grave. She works with Chris now, and presumably we'll pick up with her in the variety show of sci-fi horror or Fae horror or clown horror or whatever it is that Resident Evil 9 eventually decides to be. Okay, we got through the main series summaries. Now, here's Sophie's definitive play guide for Resident Evil. In some ways, it's a bit of a boring one. I do think you should start at the start. Play Resident Evil 1 first. No big shock there. But then play the remakes. They're fucking amazing. They're masterpieces. They rock. They're so cool. You should play the originals too, but you should play them first. I've barely even talked about them here. I'm saving it all for the game design episode because the remakes are just so good and there's so much to talk about. Play Resi 1, Resi 2 remake, Resi 3 remake, and then this is where I think things get interesting because the middle period is such unrepentant dog shit. Here, I think you could either go play Resident Evil 4, then 7 and Village, or play 7 and Village and then 4. Actually, I'd love if people tried that to hear how people experienced them differently and what people thought. My reasoning is 7 is the scariest, and 8 follows from 7, so you have to play them together, and 4 is the good one of the second trilogy, so it's a little hard to place. It isn't really a sequel to 3, or even 2 for that matter, it's just its own little thing. As for Resi 5 and 6, you can play them if you've really been enjoying the others and need to know the complete story, but people get banned off YouTube nowadays for advising people to do things that are that harmful to their health, so I really can't recommend it. Code Veronica? No. Okay, I think we can successfully say you now understand what happens in Resident Evil. But can we say you understand Resident Evil? Maybe we need to think about what that was all about. So, what are the uniting elements of the franchise? Let's start with the protagonist. The motto here seems to be well-meaning, fun, and dumb as a bag of hammers. Horror protagonists often serve as a stepping stone and helpful way to process the horror for the audience. They're scared so you feel more scared, or they're blissfully unaware of something, you're yelling at the screen, "No, don't go in there, that's Knife Hand McGee's basement!" In Resident Evil, our protagonists are wacky, charming, cheesy, and while not usually unaware of their immediate surroundings, they usually take everything one step at a time, and are never put down too much by the things going on around them, considering the monster right in front of them, and little else. It's the perfect tone of character to have accompanying you through the experience. Resident Evil protagonists are simple, well-meaning, and hot, because they're cartoon characters for you to hold on to if you get scared in the haunted house. In fact, this character archetype is so core to the series that every turn towards seriousness feels incredibly silly. Chris Redfield haunted by the horrors of war? What? This is the guy that burst out laughing when Wesker showed him the Tyrant. Chris and Leon pulling their guns on each other feels so silly and contrived. It's like the conflict in a pro wrestling match. Resident Evil just loves the he-bimbos, the himbos, and that's why I promised my patrons for months and months that this series would contain my definitive Resident Evil himbo rankings. There's just one problem. I don't really believe in ranking characters. I don't think you can put characters on one axis like that and just say this guy's better and this guy's worse. So, I'm going to put them on two axes. Here's the political compass positions of every himbo in Resident Evil. You will notice the grouping is towards authoritarian right, and that's because all the Resident Evil characters are cops. Except Carlos, he's actually a Maoist, and Luis, he's a weird libertarian NFT guy. I did have to debate whether Ethan Winters should go on here. He doesn't have a face, and therefore cannot be considered hot, and it does annoy me that people keep calling men himbos just because they're dumb, but he is a Resident Evil protagonist, so even though we never see his face, we can infer it's probably a nice one. Ethan is one of the only non-cop characters, but he clearly wants to be a cop, and that's the psychological profile of a serial killer, so he goes here. I sense that you're saying, Sophie, hang on, Wesker isn't a himbo, he's an omnicidal eugenicist monster, and that is true, but he does also think he's doing the right thing, which makes him a diminutive form of himbo, the him-bad. Wait, does that mean I need to put Mr. X and the Nemesis on here too? Hang on. Okay. The Ustanak and the Nemesis are both corporate stooges, but Mr. X is just doing it for the money, and his personal politics are very different. And he's really nice when you get to know him. Okay, that's the characters sorted, but what else links Resident Evil together? The games are just so chaotic and varied. The obvious answer would be zombies, but the games go to some lengths to keep on not technically having zombies, but infected, mutants, mold men, cultists, werewolves, and on and on. I've gone on ad nauseum in this video about how Resident Evil games function like haunted houses, and I think that's maybe the strongest link throughout all of the series. When I said about Resi 6 that the developers failed to appreciate their own strength, I meant they should have seen what makes the franchise work is when it starts by trying to scare people and fills all the details in afterwards. That's what was so good about the originals, that's what brought the games back around in recent years to being better than they've ever been before. That's why the overarching plot has always been so convoluted and largely gibberish, and that's what the developers strayed away from in the middle period, making the second trilogy so unbelievably dire. Resi 5 and 6 weren't good because they weren't Resident Evil enough, and they weren't Resident Evil because they just weren't scary. It's surely no accident that the scariest game was the one that resurrected the franchise. And I think it's no coincidence that all the weakest parts of Resi 7 and 8 were the parts that tried to find explanations and tie them into a larger plot. Resident Evil is at the absolute top of its form when it decides to put scaring the player first and foremost, and sweats the details later on. And that's always been the case. Is that bad? I think there's an approach to media analysis that creates a certain hierarchy of intelligent and deep meaning in art, and I myself have definitely engaged with this approach sometimes. But to bring back around our discussion from before, is cheap or dumb or easy art bad? Increasingly recently, I have to admit that subtlety and masterful control of minutiae are more signifiers that pretentious art critics look to prove that they have a more refined palate than ordinary media enjoyers. For God's sake, Mad Max Fury Road was one of the single best films made in the last 30 years, and it's loud and obvious as hell. It hits you right over the head with its messaging. Its narrative is simple, but its characters are rich. Action, compelling, world-building, stylistic, and mesmerizing. Cinematic rhythm, absolutely hypnotic. We need to have more appreciation for dumb, loud franchises like Resident Evil, because even while we can acknowledge that they put different priorities first, and while we can see clearly that elements like meaning, plot, character, and so on take a backseat to something more visceral, we can also acknowledge that as a different and equally as valid approach to art. Michelangelo once said that inside every block of stone is a statue, and the task of a sculptor is to discover it. Well, I think that inside every one of us is the ability to articulate eloquently our complex and rich fears about life and the world, and it's the challenge that Resident Evil developers take on to help us discover how to do that. In Resident Evil, fear comes first, and in that way, a Resident Evil game is like a trip, a sensational, experiential journey driven by immediate visceral reactions to whatever places that the quest for the spookiest frights takes us. In Resident Evil 7, for example, the whole game plays with a rural Americana that fits in neatly with the Americana given to us in Raccoon City. These two clearly exist in the same world, however this place has a different vibe. The loneliness, the isolation, the distance between you and the nearest hospital or police station, or even just McDonald's, is all part of the setting. The Baker family, left to live and keep living, unable to break free, unable to die, are an encapsulation of this kind of loneliness and the different effects it could have on different people. That is, of course, until the end, when we see the Baker family's condition as relating back to Evelyn, the crashed ship, and the biohazard in the wetlands. You find yourself presented with imagery evoking an oil spill, people choked by black grease, the ruptured hull of a breached ship, the black, oily slime disrupting the relative serenity of the wetlands. What does this all mean? You could write pages and pages about it, and once again, I fully intend to. But I think what's delightful about this looser approach to meaning is the way that it gives you, the player, more agency in finding the meaning for yourself. I decided to structure this series in stages of understanding, because barest minimum, not everyone has time to play all these games, so first I needed to catch you up on what these games even are. But next time, if you really want to discover fear with me, we're going to talk about how these games really tick, how they come together, how they frighten you. Next time, we'll see everything you love over again. Designing Resident Evil. See you then. I'd like to thank Molly Noyes for making the incredible music that I use on this channel, Quill, who made my Claire Redfield costume, the Patreon supporters who make all my work possible, and you, the viewer, for watching all the way to the end. There will be more Resimania videos, and they will be available early for $2 plus patrons over at patreon.com/Sophie from Mars. If you want to read scripts early or hear early episodes of my TTRPG actual play podcast Rolling with Rainbows, please consider giving $3 or more than $3. And if you want to join the Sophie from Mars Patreon Discord, pledge $5 or more for access. As many of you have already noticed, I have rebranded my online presence. I was getting really tired of having to tell people multiple different names all the time when I was plugging my stuff. So from now on, I'm Sophie from Mars on YouTube, Patreon, Twitter and Twitch, and wherever else. The channel and most of my work is still a collaborative effort, and I'm just trying to tighten up my online branding. I think it has a few good elements to it, like it's very 90s, I think. It also reminds me of my favorite books, the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. I could probably go on and on about this. There's more stuff besides, but it's too much to get into in a credits crawl. Okay, please check out patreon.com/Sophie from Mars. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast Rolling with Rainbows if you want to hear spooky Call of Cthulhu shenanigans. And I'll see you all really soon for more Resimania. Bye for now.